In this video, I will be performing The Phantom of Goldberg by Grégoire Jeay. Jeay is both a composer and a performer. As a composer, he has written music for the concert hall, for soundtracks, and for live visual art performances. He's also a Baroque flutist and regularly performs with leading ensembles such as Tafelmusik. The Phantom of Goldberg was commissioned by Tafelmusik for the Goldberg Variations program of April 2020. This is how Jeay describes The Phantom of Goldberg. Quote, "In conceiving this piece for solo harpsichord, I have opted for a language that in its essence is that of 18th century Europe, but which includes some harmonic and rhythmic freedoms that step outside this frame. I chose not to write a 31st variation, but rather to offer an ouverture à la française, which announces, very modestly, the immensity of this masterpiece. Bach himself writes a variation in overture form at the midpoint of the set, but it seemed to me appropriate to introduce another, as the overture style perfectly evokes the Baroque epoch and the nobility of the immense project which is the Goldbergs." End quote. I recently posted a recording of Nathan Mondry's suite in D minor, which was written a year earlier than The Phantom of Goldberg. Both Mondry and Jeay are well-known performers in the early music scene, and for both, the original impetus for their respective compositions involves in some way the Baroque era. However, their compositional approaches are markedly different. In Mondry's suite, the elements of Baroque language have been so thoroughly assimilated that we are dealing with a piece that could be mistaken for a real 18th century composition, especially since it does not allude to a particular composer, but rather creates its own original and individual musical identity. In contrast, Jeay creates a compelling amalgam of Baroque gestures and contemporary harmonic practice. What I would like to do in this introduction is to explore how these two elements interact throughout the work. However, before I begin, it is important to emphasize that what makes The Phantom of Goldberg so compelling is that these elements do not maintain separate identities, but are rather integrated into a coherent and unified composition with its own unique sound world. So let's look at how the piece unfolds in terms of melodic gestures, harmony, and form. And I hope that this presentation will help you navigate a little more easily through its imaginative landscape. The opening gesture, with its dotted rhythmic profile, clearly references the genre of the French overture. So this is what the very first gesture of the piece sounds like. The Goldberg variations contain one variation in the style of a French overture. It is the 16th variation, and structurally it serves as the opening movement for the second half of the work. This is what it sounds like. Interestingly enough, if I were to associate the opening gesture of The Phantom of Goldberg with Bach's music, the piece that first comes, at least to my mind, is another French-style overture Bach wrote for harpsichord, more specifically, the opening movement of the French overture in B minor, BWV 831, which also has a fairly similar rhythmic motive that also contains 3 30-second notes. So that one sounds like this. So to me at least, these two, the Phantom of Goldberg and this particular overture from the French overture, are more similar. So here's the Phantom of Goldberg, and here's the French overture. To me at least, those are more similar than the French overture variation that we find in the Goldberg variations. If we examine the opening phrase of the Phantom of Goldberg, we will see that the harmony outlines a standard harmonic movement from tonic to dominant. In other words, from G major to D major. And I should probably mention here that, yes, the Phantom of Goldberg is in G major, just like Bach's Goldberg variations are in G major. So here's now what the first phrase of the Phantom of Goldberg sounds like. However, this tonic to dominant move is achieved not through a standard harmonic progression, but rather an ascending chromatic bass line harmonized with mostly extended chords. And what I mean by this is that if you pay attention just to the bass line, in other words, indeed, the opening section of the piece consists of 4 such similar, but not identical, ascending harmonic movements from tonic to dominant, always beginning with the same opening gesture and each time containing different details and flourishes. The next section functions as a sort of transition. Up to now, the harmony has always ascended from G to D. Here, however, both the left hand and the right hand engage in mostly descending lines that eventually lead to a statement of the original opening motive, but now in the relative key of E minor. So let me play that section. So imagine now that we are in the very last of those 4 statements of the motive in the first section, and then we get into this kind of transitional material. And here, of course, is our relative E minor. Very soon afterwards, a new section begins, which is initially built upon a pedal point on the note B. And what I mean by this is that we have a certain flourish in the right hand, but the left hand remains on the note B right now, right here. Etc., etc. This section also has a very different character and clearly alludes to a fantasia, especially because a significant portion of it primarily consists of chordal arpeggiations, something we also frequently find in fantasias by Bach. So if we were to continue from where I left off, we would eventually get to a section that sounds like this. etc., etc. What follows is another short transition culminating in an accelerating passage work that harmonically outlines a D dominant chord. The next section begins in the home key of G major, but the original opening material has now been transformed into arpeggiated figures, and there is also a new rhythmic variant of 3 against 2 between the right hand and the left hand. So let me play a little bit of the next section. Etc., etc. The way I perceive this section, it is as if the opening motive and the fantasia section have merged together. The bass line still outlines a mostly chromatic ascent that harmonically reaches the dominant of D major. In other words, if you pay attention to the left hand, etc., etc. There is another statement of the opening motive, once again resembling its original configuration in slower tempo, marked lento in the score, but now both the continuation of the motive as well as its accompanying harmonic line are going to gradually descend to D major. So we get to this section here. This harmonic descent is also going to inform the next section, where we return to a 3 against 2 rhythmic profile. So the next section starts like this. And you can tell that the bass line is again going down, it's descending. This will gradually give way to another accelerating passage work that will lead to the last statement of the opening theme, which this time also serves to conclude the piece. There are a couple of noteworthy features of this final statement. The first one is that, in contrast to the beginning of the piece, the bass line is going to chromatically descend from the tonic G to the dominant of D. So here's the very last phrase of the piece. And of course, the descent that I'm talking about, again in the left hand, the second feature is that the final measures present something very close to a quotation from the aria of the Goldberg variations. What I find fascinating, however, is that Jeay has chosen to quote not the concluding measures of the aria, but rather the last measures of the aria's first section. In other words, this is what happens here. If we go to the Goldberg variations, and you know the aria, etc., etc., what happens is this, that the aria itself is going to conclude in this way, and I'm just going to play the last 3 or 4 measures of the aria. which is of course very different from the way the fandom of Goldberg concludes. However, the first section of the aria concludes in this way. So this one is what we hear in the fandom of Goldberg. To me, this is one more example of Jeay's imaginative treatment of Baroque material, where instead of going for the more predictable option of quoting the parallel portion of the original work, he opts for a less obvious choice, which, however, still provides an equally satisfying result and a fitting conclusion to the piece. Originally, this is where I had planned to conclude this introduction to the fandom of Goldberg. However, I started thinking that as I am in the middle of making a series of videos about temperaments, I could perhaps talk a little bit about my choice of temperament for this piece, and more specifically, my choice to use my favorite Rameau temperament. Now, before I go on, I should mention two things. First of all, this is completely unscripted. Secondly, my choice to use this type of temperament is purely my own personal decision. There is no indication in the score regarding temperaments at all. So, why did I choose the Rameau temperament? First of all, I would say that this particular temperament has become my favorite temperament because I like its colors. However, it is not a circulating temperament. And what this means is that I cannot play in every single tonality if I'm going to use it. So it's more flexible, if you want to think of it in those terms. It's more flexible than quarter comma mean tone. I can play in more tonalities than I can in quarter comma mean tone, but I still can't play in all of them. However, my tendency is to try to use it as long as I can get away with it, just because I like it so much. So now, why did I choose it for this particular piece? What I would say in general, and this is something that I also want to talk about in those temperament videos I'm making, is that choosing historical temperaments is, to me at least, something that I do because of the expressive possibilities that they have, the expressive impact that they have. So I don't just choose them just to be historically correct. I choose them because they make a difference in expression, and they influence at least the way not only I perceive the piece, but also the way I perform the piece. And what I wanted to do is to kind of highlight a couple of areas where using this particular temperament affected my performing choices. And then, of course, as you listen to the piece with the score, I hope that you can kind of see exactly what is going on within the context of the entire piece. So the first place is the transition section that I mentioned, the first transition section of the piece, where we go to E minor, where eventually we get to the opening theme being stated in E minor. And this is a section where I would say we are really moving quite far away from G major, and we are going towards certain chords that one could, if I were to simplify things a little bit, are perhaps slightly going beyond tonality or beyond what we would recognize as tonal chords. And at that point, what happens is that, of course, with this type of temperament, it helps us to really understand that suddenly we have left our initial world of G major, and now we're entering in very, very unfamiliar territory. And I will show you exactly why this happens. Let me play that section one more time, and I want to pay particular attention and kind of stop at one particular sonority. This one here. You can tell that there's something very spicy or something very different about this. And for one thing, you could say, well, one of the reasons is because we have a E sharp in the left hand against an E natural in the right hand. But this is not all that is going on here. The other issue is this chord. It's a C sharp major chord, but if you listen to it carefully, it doesn't really sound like a regular C sharp major chord. It has a much more spicy character, precisely because the Rameau temperament I'm using is not really meant to go that far in terms of, you know, a tonality with 7 sharps. So combining both the fact that the temperament itself is pushed to its limits with the fact that we have this kind of dissonance between the two hands creates this almost otherworldly effect, and it really leads very nicely to the eventual modulation in E minor. It's a very, very dark effect, and you would not really feel that difference if I had tuned the instrument to say equal temperament. All of this would be lost. So how does this affect my playing of the piece? Well, when you listen to it, you will notice that once I get to this section, I relax the tempo a little bit. So it's not that I'm playing more slowly per se, but it's ever so slightly a little slower because I really want to savor those very different and those very, very flavorful sonorities that are being produced because of the temperament that I'm using. The other section where I would say you can see how my choice of using a Rameau temperament affects my performance is when we get to the Fantasia section that I mentioned. In other words, what starts like this. Etc., etc. And now, what is happening there, when you listen to my performance, you will notice that, of course, my tempo is a little more flexible. This is a Fantasia after all, but you will notice that there are certain chords and certain harmonies where I really pull back the tempo. I really slow down a little bit more. Now, obviously, when we're playing such a section, slowing down and speeding up doesn't only have to do with temperament. It also has to do with where the harmony is going, whether there are certain harmonic surprises, if we're reaching some sort of cadence, etc., etc. However, to me at least, when I get to a particular harmony that I know is going to sound a little more different, let's say, again, a little more flavorful, and this comes because I have used this temperament, this Rameau temperament, for such a long time now that I kind of know its characteristics. I know what it is going to do. And I know as I'm getting towards a particular chord or a particular harmony that something is going to sound a little different. Maybe this chord is not going to sound like a regular major chord or minor chord. And in those places where I know this kind of thing is going to happen, I want to savor those moments, again, because we're doing something that is a little different. So as you're listening to the piece, there are obviously other moments where the temperament is going to, in some respects, dictate the kinds of rhythmic freedoms that I'm going to take, the kinds of interpretive choices I make. But I hope that at least those two sections that I highlighted for you, you can listen to them as the whole piece is played and see exactly what is happening. As I said, pulling back the tempo a little bit, or kind of expanding certain areas and really trying to savor the kinds of sounds, the kinds of sonorities that are produced by using this particular temperament. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.